Welcome to our presentation on protecting Michigan seniors, organized by the St. Clair County Seniors Age Well Task Force and Lakeshore Legal Aid. My name is Khadija McFadden, and I am an elder law attorney at Lakeshore Legal Aid. We are very thankful that Kristen Steindorf from the Michigan Attorney General's Office has availed herself to give this presentation on the protections afforded by Michigan's Financial Exploitation Prevention Act. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Steindorf is the first Assistant Attorney General in the Financial Crimes Division of the Michigan Department of the Attorney General. Kristen prosecutes complex white-collar crimes, including those involving elder financial exploitation, insurance fraud, and tax fraud. Kristen is an active member of the Michigan Elder Abuse Task Force. She currently chairs the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act Implementation Subcommittee of the task force, along with the Multicultural Inclusion Subcommittee and the Subcommittee for Training Officers and Prosecutors. Before coming to the Department of Attorney General, Kristen served as an assistant prosecuting attorney in Ionia County for 8 years. Kristen graduated from the Michigan State University College of Law. Please take it from here, Assistant Attorney General Steindorf.
Good afternoon. Just a few things to go over this morning before we proceed. First, I must advise you that I am speaking on my own behalf and my own personal capacity and not on behalf of the Attorney General this morning. The other thing that I would ask that as we proceed, if you can please hold questions until the end, that will allow us time to explain the framework of the Act, and then I'll be happy to address any questions at the conclusion of the presentation. In March of 2019, the Michigan Elder Abuse Task Force was formed by Attorney General Dana Nessel and the Michigan Supreme Court. From the beginning, the task force was action-oriented. The task force began its work with a list of 9 initiatives to accomplish and has been continuing to build on those goals since its inception. One of those first initiatives was to mandate reporting for financial institutions on suspected financial exploitation. To that end, Senate Bill 464 was first introduced by Senators Lucido and Johnson in 2019. The substitute bill was passed by the Senate and the House in December of 2020. And on December 30th of 2020, the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act was signed by the governor and went into effect on September 26th of 2021. The Financial Exploitation Prevention Act, or FEPA, provides a mechanism for financial institutions to report covered financial exploitation of their members or customers. For purposes of the Act, financial institutions means banks and credit unions. The Act also allows financial institutions to freeze customer transactions and to freeze customer assets in certain circumstances. And that's important because we all know that in most cases, once a scammer gets a hold of a vulnerable adult's money, that money is gone and we can't get it back. FEPA is also important because in many cases, a bank or credit union may have the best chance of spotting suspicious spending, so it's critical that they report it when they see it. Even before the pandemic, many vulnerable adults were living fairly isolated lives. The one constant is that in order to meet their basic needs, they have to use the bank or credit union to pay their bills. Many older adults don't use online banking and prefer to go to the bank in person. So that weekly bank visit may be one of the few times anyone else sees what is happening to an older adult's money. I can tell you that I handled one case in which the victim was in her 90s and living alone when she got scammed by her investment advisor. She never had children, her husband had died 10 years ago, and her siblings had also predeceased her. She had a nephew that lived in another state, and a niece that was busy taking care of another family member. Her niece only checked on her occasionally and didn't pay any attention to what was going on with their finances. She said she didn't consider it her business. When the victim became concerned because she couldn't figure out what happened to her money, she went to her bank for help because she didn't know who else she could trust. Now, under the Act, financial institutions must develop policies and training for recognizing covered financial exploitation of its customers, reporting that activity when it happens, and freezing assets or transactions when exploitation is suspected. Financial institutions can report covered financial exploitation of any customer or member when they see it, but the Act requires institution policies to include training and procedures for reporting covered financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Vulnerable adult is defined by the Act as an adult who, because of mental or physical impairment or advanced age, is unable to protect herself or himself from covered financial exploitation. It's important to note that this definition is specific to the Act, as vulnerable adult is defined differently in other areas of Michigan law. The policy put in place by the financial institution may, but is not required to, cover reporting for other members or customers of the financial institution who are not vulnerable adults. Among other things, an institution policy must include procedures to follow when covered financial exploitation is suspected or detected, procedures for when exploitation is no longer suspected after investigation of available facts, procedures to follow when placing a freeze or hold on an account, and designation of employees who will make any reports under the Act. Financial exploitation means a fraudulent or otherwise illegal, unauthorized, or improper act or process of an individual who either uses or attempts to use the financial resources of another individual for monetary or personal benefit, profit, or gain, or that results or is intended to result in depriving another individual of rightful access to or use of benefits, resources, belongings, or assets. The term covered financial exploitation is defined by the Act as financial exploitation of an individual through deception, manipulation, coercion, intimidation, or improper leveraging of a caregiver relationship. When a financial institution suspects or detects that one of their members has been a victim of covered financial exploitation, they must report it to either law enforcement or adult protective services. The Act leaves it to the discretion of the institution as to which agency they choose to report to, or the institution can make a report to both APS and law enforcement if they choose to. Under the Act, a law enforcement agency, APS, or the county prosecutor generally must not disclose the identity of the financial institution or the individual making the report without the consent of the individual or institution. However, there are exceptions, as the statute allows for information sharing by not prohibiting APS from disclosing the identity of the institution or the reporter to law enforcement, and by not prohibiting APS and law enforcement from disclosing the identity of the institution or reporter to the county prosecutor to make a report under FEPA. Finally, the statute also does not prohibit disclosure of the institution or reporter as required in a civil or criminal proceeding. Law enforcement, APS, or the county prosecutor must also not disclose the identity or personal account information of the victim unless the victim consents to disclosure, except to make a report to the county prosecutor under this Act, and except as may be required in a civil or criminal court proceeding. Under the Act, the financial institution can delay a transaction or freeze the assets of a customer if the financial institution suspects or detects covered financial exploitation. There are limits to the financial institution's ability to delay or freeze transactions or assets. The default is that any delay or freeze must be done according to the terms of the customer's account agreement, if there isn't an account agreement in place that applies. If there is no applicable account agreement, the financial institution can delay or freeze for up to 10 business days, or according to the terms of any applicable court order. If the financial institution is informed by APS or law enforcement that a reported incident is under investigation, the institution may extend the freeze or delay until the institution is informed that the investigation has been resolved, or until the financial institution reasonably believes there is no continued risk of covered financial exploitation of the targeted individual, whichever is later. So to summarize, The freeze or delay typically can continue up to 10 business days unless APS or law enforcement tells the financial institution they are investigating the incident, in which case the freeze or delay can be extended, or unless there is a court order which extends or shortens the delay. Even during a delay or freeze, the financial institution may allow for the processing of any transaction needed to preserve the health, safety, or well-being of a customer, unless the transaction is related to the suspected exploitation or unless directed otherwise by court order. The purpose of this exception is to make sure vulnerable adults can still pay for the things they must, like prescription medications or utility bills, without putting any more of their assets at risk than necessary. After APS or law enforcement receives a report of covered financial exploitation from a financial institution, APS or law enforcement has 10 business days to notify the designated contact of the financial institution whether an incident is under investigation or has been referred to law enforcement for investigation. Unless there is an account agreement that says otherwise, financial institutions can only continue an initial hold or freeze for 10 business days, unless they hear from APS or law enforcement that an incident is being investigated. If they don't hear that an investigation has been opened within those 10 business days, they have to release the funds. So that's why it's so important that APS or law enforcement notifies a financial institution whether a reported incident is under investigation or has been referred to law enforcement within 10 business days. If APS or law enforcement does not inform the financial institution within 10 business days whether an incident is under investigation or has been referred to law enforcement for investigation, then the financial institution may make an additional report directly to the county prosecutor. APS and law enforcement also must provide notice to the county prosecutor within 10 business days of receiving a report of suspected or detected covered financial exploitation from a financial institution. Finally, APS and law enforcement must notify the financial institution of the disposition of the reported incident as soon as practicable. Once the financial institution is informed that a reported incident is under investigation, they may extend the freeze or hold until they are informed that the matter has been resolved, or until the financial institution believes there is no continued risk of exploitation, whichever is later. That means that the freeze or the hold will continue at least until the financial institution is informed the investigation is over. If APS or law enforcement never tells the financial institution that that investigation is over, that freeze or hold on a victim's account could theoretically continue indefinitely, which of course we want to avoid. The financial institution may make a report to the county prosecutor if APS or law enforcement fails to notify the financial institution of the final disposition of the incident as soon as practicable after the investigation. So, as an example of how this would all work in practice, if TCF Bank made a report to the Michigan State Police, the state police would have to let TCF know within 10 business days whether the reported incident was under investigation. The state police would also have to notify the county prosecutor's office of receipt of the report within 10 business days. In most circumstances, the investigation probably won't be completed within 10 business days. However, if the state police tells TCF that the incident is under investigation, TCF will know that they need to continue that delay or freeze to protect the vulnerable adult's money. Then when the investigation is complete, the state police will again contact TCF to let them know the outcome of the investigation. So TCF will know whether there is an ongoing risk to the vulnerable adult's money or whether they can safely release the freeze or delay. If the state police does not notify TCF Bank within 10 business days of the initial report whether that incident is under investigation, or if the state police does not notify TCF of the final disposition of the report, then TCF has the option to provide notice directly to the county prosecutor. Under the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act, the required notice to the prosecutor by APS or law enforcement and the optional notices to the prosecutor by the financial institution all must be made in a manner prescribed by the Attorney General's office. To that end, Administrative Rule Set 2021-34 AG took effect on October 28th of 2021. That rule set dictates how notification should be made to the county prosecutor under the Act. These rules were drafted by a subcommittee of the Elder Abuse Task Force that included representatives of banks and credit unions, the Department of Insurance and Financial Services, law enforcement, prosecutors, and Adult Protective Services. The rule set includes one form for use by APS and law enforcement, and a second form for use by the financial institutions, all to provide notice to the county prosecutor's office. The rule set also includes instructions for financial institutions on how they should determine which county prosecutor to contact. The administrative rules, the form for APS and law enforcement to notify the county prosecutor of a report of covered exploitation under the Act, the form for financial institutions to notify the county prosecutor directly of the covered exploitation under the Act, and the directory of non-emergency police contact numbers are all available at michiganprosecutor.org. I have the link up on the screen, and once you reach that page at the link, you'll see an option to click on the Public Resources menu on the right-hand side of the page, and that will take you to those documents. This is a copy of the form that Adult Protective Services and law enforcement will use to notify the county prosecutor they've received a report of covered financial exploitation from a financial institution. The form requires APS and law enforcement to attach a copy of their individual reports and a copy of any written report or information submitted by the financial institution, along with a description of the actions taken by APS or law enforcement. If the form is submitted by APS, for example, the APS employee would attach a copy of the APS report, which would include information provided by the financial institution. And then the report would also, and then the person submitting the form would also describe any actions APS took upon receipt of the report from the financial institution. This is a copy of the form that a financial institution will use to notify the county prosecutor they've had a problem with communication with APS or law enforcement when the financial institution made a report under the Act. The form requires a description of the institution's efforts to contact APS or law enforcement and a description of the alleged covered financial exploitation that was observed. Now again, the administrative rules prescribe the manner of notification for financial institutions who notify the county prosecutor's office of covered financial exploitation under the rules. Essentially, the financial institution may contact the county prosecutor whenever there's a problem with notification to or from Adult Protective Services or law enforcement. The Financial Exploitation Prevention Act allows the financial institution to contact the prosecutor if the institution cannot communicate at all with law enforcement or APS, or if the institution doesn't receive required notices about the reported incident from law enforcement or APS. This means that before contacting the county prosecutor, the financial institution must first attempt to contact APS or law enforcement. Now, as many of you know, APS can be contacted statewide by calling their central intake number, but law enforcement must be contacted depending on location. To contact law enforcement, the financial institution must call 911 if the event is an emergency, or if the covered financial exploitation is actively taking place on site when they're making that call. If neither of those apply and the financial institution knows the victim's address, the financial institution must contact law enforcement in the county where the victim lives. If the victim's residence is unknown, the financial institution should contact law enforcement in the county where the exploitation was observed. Or if the covered exploitation didn't take place in Michigan, the financial institution must contact law enforcement in the county where the reporting financial institution is located. After the financial institution tries to contact APS or law enforcement, again, they may contact the county prosecutor's office if there is a problem with those required notifications. If the financial institution was able to contact APS or law enforcement, and the financial institution knows where the APS worker or law enforcement officer is located, then the financial institution should contact the county prosecutor where that worker or officer is stationed. This situation will be most common when the financial institution made contact with APS or law enforcement, but then the financial institution didn't receive required follow-up notifications from the agency handling the reported incident. So for example, if Fifth Third Bank calls law enforcement to report covert exploitation of a victim who lives in Bloomfield Hills, Fifth Third Bank may be speaking to an officer at the Oakland County Sheriff's Department, because that's where Bloomfield Hills is. It's in Oakland County. That's where the victim lives. The officer at the Oakland County Sheriff's Department should notify the bank within 10 business days whether the matter is under investigation. The officer should also tell the bank what the final disposition or result of the investigation is. If the officer doesn't do those things, the bank may choose to contact the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office. Similarly, the bank may have chosen to call Adult Protective Services instead of law enforcement. They may have spoken to a caseworker, and the caseworker may have told the bank that they were employed by DHHS in Oakland County. In that case, if that caseworker doesn't send the bank the required follow-up notifications, then the bank may contact the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office. Now, if the financial institution tried to contact APS or law enforcement but was unable to do so, or if the financial institution doesn't know where the APS worker or law enforcement officer is stationed, then the rules contain additional steps the financial institution must follow to determine in which county to contact the county prosecutor. If the financial institution knows where the victim lives, then the financial institution must contact the prosecutor in the county where the victim lives. If the victim's residence is unknown, the financial institution must contact the prosecutor in the county where the exploitation was observed. If the exploitation took place out of state, the financial institution should contact law enforcement where the reporting financial institution is located. That means that if an employee at MSU Credit Union, located in East Lansing and Ingham County, observes the financial exploitation, isn't able to contact law enforcement, and isn't sure where the victim lives, then the credit union would contact the Ingham County Prosecutor's Office because the exploitation was observed in Ingham County. Now, if you know of an organization that you believe would benefit from this presentation, please let them know that they can reach out to the Department of Attorney General to request a presentation. To do that, they can email me at steindorfk@michigan.gov. We also ask that requesters send a description of the audience's professional background, the number of expected participants, whether the presentation would be virtual or in person, and requested dates and times. We strongly encourage requests for virtual presentations, especially for smaller groups, as if you have a small group presentation request, we may ask you to combine events with another interested group. Now, you'll notice that the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act only imposes responsibilities on credit unions, banks, APS, law enforcement, and to a lesser extent, county prosecutors' offices. However, anyone can help continue to identify and report financial exploitation, even if they don't have specific responsibilities under the Act itself. We have had a number of individuals contact us on behalf of community organizations asking what they can do to help or to educate their members. So as awareness grows, you may start fielding questions at your offices as well. In order to report suspected financial exploitation to anyone, potential reporters have to know what to look for. Some of the common rackets that target elder adults that can be easier to identify include things like prize scams and phony charities. Investment scams are a little harder to spot, especially since they can be more sophisticated. If you hear a senior talking about how they invested their money with an advisor who promised a high guaranteed rate of return, that's a cause for concern. You should consider asking some questions about the investment advisor or the investments. You might ask how the adult met the investment advisor, what they know about their investments, how they check their account status or account balances, and whether they've ever tried to withdraw any money from their accounts. We have seen cases in my office in which an adult receives what looks like a printed statement every single month, but all that statement really is a piece of paper the scammer generated on their computer, sometimes just in Microsoft Word. So it's important to determine how the senior knows their investments are being safeguarded properly and not just diverted to their advisor's pocket. In terms of general signs of financial exploitation, look out for sudden changes in the senior's financial condition. If you have a homebound client who was always financially stable, always lived modestly, always paid her bills on time, and suddenly that same client has an expensive vehicle in her driveway and past due utility notices on her kitchen table, you should consider why that might be happening. That's especially true if the financial change coincides with the appearance of a new friend or long-lost family member. If you notice heirlooms and other valuables missing around the house, you should consider asking what happened to those items, because someone in their lives could be stealing those items and selling them. If a senior complains of not getting their medications, it could be that a caregiver is stealing the money earmarked to pay for that medication. Or if the medications are painkillers like Vicodin or OxyContin, a caregiver could even be stealing and selling those medications. Parasitic living is what happens when the victim is funding the perpetrator's lifestyle. Sometimes we see this with family members. A parent gets older, an adult child convinces the parent they should convert their bank account to a joint bank account so that child can help them manage their money. All the money in that account comes from the victim's pension and Social Security checks. Then once the adult child gets added to that account, the ATM withdrawals increase, and so does the spending on stores, restaurants, and even casinos. Many people have the mistaken belief that as long as their name is on a bank account, they can't be prosecuted for stealing from that account. And that just isn't true. A joint account doesn't function as a license to steal from an elder adult. Another version of parasitic living we see happens when a caregiver moves in with an elder adult. The elder adult pays the caregiver a salary, pays for all the bills and the groceries, and then pays for things like vacations and items for the caregiver. Sometimes this is because the caregiver has actually threatened to put the elder adult in a nursing home if the adult doesn't buy the things the caregiver demands. Or sometimes this happens because the caregiver threatens to leave or stop caring for the elder adult if the adult doesn't do exactly what the caregiver says. You should always note if changes in spending are linked to the appearance of someone new in the elder adult's life, or if the changes are connected to reconciliations with estranged friends or family members. If an elder adult's spending increases dramatically, even immediately after a reconciliation with an adult child, aunt, uncle, sibling, the elder adult may not be the one choosing to spend that money. Financial institutions have the best opportunity to detect changes in spending patterns or increased debit withdrawals. If a financial institution report brings these changes to your attention, you should consider whether these changes coincide with a new power of attorney or account holder being placed on an account. If the vulnerable adult account holder shows up to a branch with another person, we tell financial institution employees to watch the account holder's interactions with the other person. Is the second person trying to control the account holder's actions or telling them what to do? Does the account holder seem nervous or anxious around the second person? Is the account holder making a transaction request that, for the holder, is unusual? If you or someone you know is concerned about an elder or vulnerable adult's finances, consider asking the adult some questions about their money. You might ask things like, do you manage your own money or does someone help you? Who is the person who helps you? What things does that person help you with? How long have they helped you? Do you have everything you need, like food and medication? Do you ever get any calls or notices about unpaid bills? Depending on your job and your relationship to the victim, you can even consider asking if you can review the victim's bank statements and bills together with the victim. The purpose of doing that would be to look for things like large checks written to cash, missing checks, or multiple large payments made to one person. If you're in the position to talk to the victim's family or friends, you can also ask them whether they have any concerns about the victim's ability to carry out their daily activities or the victim's finances. Again, some of the questions you should consider asking are whether there have been any changes in the victim's life or health, or whether they've been exhibiting any recent confusion. Again, you should ask about new friends, long-lost family members in the victim's life, or whether anyone is helping the victim with their finances, and whether the victim has talked about having money problems. You might ask if they've observed new people living at the victim's house, or new vehicles at the property, or any other major changes. So, for example, if the victim requires regular in-home health assistance, you might ask if a new person has been providing care recently. If you have concerns about a vulnerable adult's ability to care for themselves and to pay for the supplies and services they need, you should call the 24-hour central intake line for Adult Protective Services. If you think a vulnerable adult may be the victim of a crime, you should contact law enforcement by either calling 911 or the local police agency phone number. You can also call both APS and law enforcement. If you think a vulnerable adult was abused in a nursing home or other licensed facility, call the Attorney General's Healthcare Fraud Division, and that's 1-800-24-ABUSE. And that concludes the presentation. At this time, does anyone have any questions about the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act or reporting elder abuse that I can answer?
Thank you, Assistant Attorney General Steindorf. We do have some questions coming in. I would like to point out to the participants who are unfamiliar with Teams live events, there should be an icon in the toolbar on your screen that shows 2 talk bubbles with a question mark in it. Go ahead and post your questions to that chat, and then I will read them off to the Assistant Attorney General. And I see some of you have found it, so thank you. Ms. Steindorf, our first question is, what if I have a client who needs to pay bills, but their bank account has been frozen under this act?
Yes, the bank does have the ability to allow for the processing of any transaction necessary to preserve the health, safety, or well-being of a customer, basically unless that transaction is the subject of a report of suspected financial exploitation. The bank does not have to allow for that, but they can. So you may wish to consider either having a conversation with the bank with your client to make that request, or giving that information to your client so they can have that conversation themselves. And the reason that loophole was carved out was, again, to make sure that individuals can pay the bills they have to pay that can't wait, things like mortgages, prescriptions, groceries, while at the same time preserving the remaining property to the extent possible.
Thank you. The next question, there's actually a couple of questions that are similar, so I appreciate all of the participation. I'm going to combine these two. Have there been an increase of abuse reports as a result of this act, and how many cases have successfully been prosecuted?
Well, this act only took effect in September of 2021, so it hasn't been in effect for very long at this point. I do know that we have been working with Adult Protective Services as far as monitoring the implementation of this act and trying to address any issues or difficulties with implementation that might arise. And Adult Protective Services has reported that they are seeing a significant increase in the number of reports of financial exploitation that are coming in from a financial institution. In this past month, they've made reports for the month of January, and they've indicated they've received over 300 reports of financial exploitation coming in from a financial institution just during that month alone. And they've also indicated that their assignment rate, or the number of cases that, or percentage of cases that are assigned to a caseworker for additional investigation, is on track with the same percentage of what's typically assigned, if not higher. So we know that financial institutions are making those reports, and we know that as a result, eyes are on these financial transactions. As far as the number of cases prosecuted, that doesn't lend itself to tracking in quite the same way, because really there are 2 different tracks that these reports can take. One track is the financial institution can make a report to Adult Protective Services, and because that is centralized, we have the ability to track the number of reports that come in through APS. But when reports are made to law enforcement, there are state level police agencies, there are county level police agencies, and then there are city level police agencies, and there is no centralized method for tracking those reports. So it really isn't possible to answer that question.
Thank you. Next, I have a client who is located in Michigan, and the bank issuing the credit card is located in Michigan, but the adult child of the client obtained the credit card in my senior client's name and used it in a different state. Can we still try and get relief for my client under this act in Michigan?
Well, This is to go slightly outside, I think, of the bounds of talking about the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act, but I will try to answer this on two different levels. As far as the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act, that is something that if the financial institution became aware of that because the victim lives in Michigan, they would make the report in the area essentially where the victim lives, if that was not an emergency at the time that they made the report. As far as whether that's something that can be prosecuted here in Michigan, that would really depend on some of the facts. It would depend, for instance, on if the victim was living here and if their account was here in Michigan, then yes, it is possible, but I can't give you a definitive answer without knowing all of the facts. And I have to add as well that, of course, that would be subject to the discretion of the individual prosecuting authority where that happened. But I can tell you that it is certainly worth making a report to the authorities here in Michigan. And I think perhaps that's really the heart of the question.
Thank you. Are there any similar statutory schemes to protect underage people in Michigan?
There are not at this time. I should mention that the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act does allow the financial institution to report exploitation that occurs to any of their member or customers. They're simply not required to under the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act. So each individual institution has its own policies and procedures that it follows, although they're required to include in those policies and procedures a method of reporting essentially covered financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. They may choose to include policies and procedures for reporting financial exploitation of anyone. And so there may very well be a number of banks and credit unions that have chosen to include that in their policy. It simply isn't mandatory under the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act.
Thank you. Next question. What if law enforcement or the financial institution itself refuses to lift the hold on the bank account?
Well, ultimately, law enforcement doesn't make the final decision about whether the freeze or hold is lifted. However, the conclusion of a law enforcement investigation may ultimately trigger the ability for a financial institution to release the hold. The Financial Exploitation Prevention Act does dictate that when a hold is being placed under this act, and I'm talking only about under this act right now because the banks are obviously subject to other both federal and state rules and regulations that may apply differently. But under this act, if the law enforcement investigation is complete, and assuming it was only referred to law enforcement for sake of this conversation and not to APS as well, if the law enforcement investigation is complete and if the financial institution has no other reason to suspect ongoing financial exploitation at that time, then really that should be lifted. If the financial institution is not lifting it, even if the law enforcement investigation is complete, for practical purposes, the best option might be to speak with the bank along with your client and ask further questions and make sure that they're aware that the law enforcement investigation is complete. And in the scenario we're talking about, I'm presuming, of course, that ultimately the law enforcement investigation did not lead to the issuance of criminal charges or prosecution, because, of course, that would change the course of things. But sometimes at this point, especially because it's early on in the implementation process, that may be the best option, is to approach this directly by communicating with the bank.
Thank you. And there again, there's a few similar questions that I'm going to combine, probably inartfully. What has been the impact of FEPA on law enforcement and prosecutors, but also what has been the response of both law enforcement and prosecutors to the implementation of the Act?
Well, as I mentioned before, this is still new, as this act did not take effect until the end of September. And so we're still monitoring and basically looking to see how this affects workload for law enforcement and prosecutors, and whether this affects the rate of the number of cases reported to law enforcement and prosecutors that are ultimately prosecuted. And this is really a two-part process because, of course, under the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act, the important thing is that these reports are getting to law enforcement. These reports are getting to APS, they're getting to prosecutors. And that was one concern that we had before, is we were concerned that law enforcement, APS, and prosecutors may not have always been aware of incidents of suspected or detected financial exploitation occurring at the financial institutions. Now that they have the information, of course, the next step is what's being done with it. And I can tell you that to that end, the Attorney General's office, specifically the Financial Crimes Division, has made itself generally available for law enforcement and prosecutors that have questions and would like to discuss this further. We are also working within the Elder Abuse Task Force. There is an ongoing subcommittee that is working to draft training material for law enforcement and prosecutors regarding investigating and prosecuting elder financial exploitation cases. And ultimately, this will result in a very detailed training manual. This will also result in both live and recorded training that law enforcement and prosecutors can view. Now that more of these reports are getting out there, we want to make sure that everyone has the resources and the training they need to be able to prosecute these cases when appropriate based on the facts.
Thank you. We've got several comments thanking you for your time and for all of the information, Assistant Attorney General. But also we have a couple of folks that are asking if they're able to get the slide deck for your presentation or if there's any other training materials that the public can access.
Yes, absolutely. I will send that material, Tracy, to you at the conclusion of this event today, and you are welcome to distribute that to attendees. Anyone who would like that is welcome to have that. At this time, we don't have additional training material available regarding the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act specifically. However, I can tell you that we are working on pulling together material for an elder abuse symposium that will likely be taking place in May or June of this year. So I would suggest that everyone keep watching on the Michigan Attorney General website. There is a page that is devoted to the Elder Abuse Task Force, and I would recommend that everyone keep their eye on that page because we will be announcing additional details once things like dates and the agenda have been firmed up.
Thank you so much. And again, on behalf of Lakeshore Legal Aid and the St. Clair County Seniors Aging Well Task Force, thank you so much for your time today and for teaching us about this very important